You knew the Nazis built concentration camps, but did you know that one of them became a laboratory where men were frozen alive in the name of science? In the heart of Bavaria, behind barbed wire and watchtowers, stood Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp. But by 1942, Dachau was no longer just a prison. It had become a stage for one of the most chilling chapters in human history. During the height of World War II, the German Luftwaffe faced a deadly problem. Pilots shot down over the North Atlantic were freezing to death within minutes. The icy waters became a graveyard of silent men. The Reich demanded a solution. How long could a man survive the freezing sea, and could that limit be extended? That question birthed one of the darkest experiments ever conducted. At the center of it all stood Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a physician of ambition and cruelty, connected directly to Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS. Rascher promised Himmler he could save countless German lives if he was given access to human test subjects. And so, with Himmler's blessing, Dachau became the testing ground for survival through science. Prison blocks were emptied and refitted with metal tanks. Water and crushed ice were poured in. Thermometers, stopwatches, and clipboards lined the walls, and one by one, the prisoners were brought in. Remove your clothes. Step into the tank. At first, they trembled, then screamed, then fell silent. The stopwatch ticked. Doctors took notes. Body temperatures were recorded as they dropped, 33 degrees, 30, 27, until the heart stopped. The Nazis called it medical research. History would call it what it truly was, murder disguised as science. Rascher's reports were cold and precise. He wrote, subject lost consciousness after 53 minutes. Reanimation attempted, failed. Cause of death, cardiac arrest due to hypothermia. Each line reduced a human life to a statistic. Each death became another data point in the Reich's pursuit of knowledge. But the horror didn't end there. When they learned how long a man could survive before death, they began testing how or if a frozen man could be revived. Some were placed under heat lamps, others were submerged in hot baths, and some were subjected to something far worse. In a letter to Himmler, Rascher reported, the most effective method of rewarming appears to be through direct body heat. Women from nearby camps were forced to lie naked with near-dead prisoners, pressed against their frozen skin in a grotesque imitation of compassion. The doctors watched, took notes, and moved on. Outside, the other prisoners heard the screams, then silence. Inside, the work continued. A survivor would later recall, they said they were trying to save German pilots, but all I saw were bodies, floating, broken, empty. When Allied forces entered Dachau in 1945, they discovered hundreds of files detailing these experiments. At first, investigators thought the documents were forgeries. The horror seemed too great, but the evidence was real. The reports bore signatures, measurements, diagrams, all in perfect order. The machinery of death had kept meticulous records. After the war, during the Nuremberg trials, these documents became evidence of crimes against humanity. Rascher himself never faced the judges. He was executed by the Nazis in 1945, accused of corruption and falsifying his data. The man who measured death with a stopwatch died by the same bullets he once heard through the walls of Dachau. Today, Dachau stands silent. Tourists walk where the tanks once stood. The wind moves through the empty corridors, carrying echoes of a cold that once killed men by the hundreds. Some of Rascher's data still exists, locked away in archives, debated by scientists who ask, should knowledge gained through torture ever be used? Some argue it might save lives. Others say using it would mean those men truly died for nothing. And so the question remains, suspended in time, like frost that never melts, you will feel the cold. That's what they told the prisoners before leading them to the tanks. And even now, decades later, we feel it too. Not on our skin, but in our souls. The cold of what happens when science loses its heart. Dr. Sigmund Rascher was not an ordinary physician. While most doctors studied to save lives, Rascher studied to understand how far the human body could be pushed before it broke. He reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, the dark architect of the SS. Every experiment, every note, every result was sent to Himmler himself. His goal, to discover how to rewarm the human body after exposure to extreme cold. But beneath that goal lay something far more sinister. The project was not just medical, it was ideological. For Himmler, understanding the limits of the Aryan body was part of a twisted dream, the creation of the perfect soldier, immune to pain, fear, or death. Rascher's science did not arise from curiosity, it arose from power, and power, when stripped of morality, becomes something monstrous. Inside the walls of Dachau, Rascher established a program that blurred the lines between research and ritual. Clinical precision merged with absolute obedience. Numbers replaced names, charts replaced faces. The human body became a variable in an equation. Each new test was recorded in meticulous detail. Rascher wrote like a scientist, but thought like a soldier. He did not question orders, only results, and his results, horrific as they were, began to attract attention. By 1942, his reports reached the high command of the Luftwaffe. German pilots who crashed into the icy waters of the North Sea rarely survived more than a few minutes. The Reich needed answers, and Rascher provided them. His letters described rapid rewarming techniques, thermal recovery phases, and body response protocols. Behind the sterile terminology lay an abyss. It is possible to revive frozen subjects using animal warmth, Rascher wrote to Himmler. Further testing is required. The words seemed clinical, almost harmless, but the reality behind them was anything but. He referred to living women from Ravensbrück, forced into what he called biological rewarming procedures. Even within the SS, whispers began to spread. Some officers were disturbed by what they heard, others fascinated, because somehow, against all odds, Rascher's data worked. German pilots who followed his survival formula lasted longer in freezing waters, and in a regime obsessed with efficiency that made his experiments valuable. 10 prisoners for every pilot saved, Rascher noted in one report, a single line that revealed the cold arithmetic of Nazi science, lives measured in usefulness, suffering measured in progress. By late 1943, Rascher's reputation inside the SS had grown. He was no longer just a doctor, he was a symbol of the new German science, precise, ruthless, loyal. Himmler personally praised his dedication. Funding increased, so did the number of test subjects. Inside Dachau, assistants filled notebooks with data, times, temperatures, pulse rates. Each chart was a story of agony, reduced to ink. Each graph, a monument to indifference. At secret conferences, military physicians reviewed Rascher's results. Some applauded the findings as unprecedented technical progress. None asked how they were obtained. To them, the ends justified the means. The survival of the German pilot outweighed the suffering of the nameless. Science had become subservient to ideology. As the experiments continued, Rascher's ambition grew. He wanted recognition, not just from Himmler, but from the scientific elite. He dreamed of presenting his research to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, of being remembered as a pioneer. He believed he was saving lives. He never realized he was erasing humanity. By mid-1943, the rumors inside the SS turned darker. Even among fanatics, there were limits. Doctors whispered that Rascher was losing control, not of his experiments, but of himself. He spoke of his work with pride, almost reverence. He described data, the way others described faith. Himmler began to take notice. Rascher's devotion no longer seemed patriotic, it seemed personal. He was becoming dangerous, even to his own superiors. Yet the reports kept coming. Each month, more detailed, more technical, more detached, each one stamped, Geheime Reichssache, top secret, and then, silence. The reports stopped. The war moved on. But what happened inside those walls remained a mystery, until the Allied forces liberated Dachau in 1945. Among the piles of documents recovered were hundreds of Rascher's original notes, charts of human temperature variation, detailed sketches of rewarming protocols, cold, methodical handwriting, like a scientist cataloging the anatomy of despair. Historians who later studied the files described them as the anatomy of cruelty. Every line, every figure, every annotation carried the weight of hundreds of lost lives. And yet, those same documents changed the world. Because when the Nuremberg trials began, Rascher's records became evidence, not of medical discovery, but of moral collapse. They forced the world to confront a question it had never dared to ask. When does science stop being science? When does knowledge become evil? Rascher's name was erased from the annals of medicine. His so-called discoveries were banned from publication, but fragments of his data survived, studied by historians, ethicists, and doctors, as a warning of what happens when the pursuit of progress loses its soul. Today, those files remain locked away in archives across Europe. They are opened only for research into medical ethics, a field that exists largely because of what Rascher did. Dr. Sigmund Rascher believed he was writing the future of medicine, but what he truly wrote was a warning, one that echoes through every laboratory, every hospital, every place where science touches human life, because knowledge without conscience is the most dangerous weapon ever created, and that was the birth of the science of suffering, a science that promised salvation, but delivered only shadows. Who was Dr. Sigmund Rascher? To some, he was a man of science, intelligent, disciplined, precise. To others, he was something much darker, a man who mistook cruelty for discovery, a man who believed that suffering could serve the state. Before Dachau, Rascher's life seemed ordinary. He had studied medicine in Munich, served briefly as a physician for the Luftwaffe, and married a woman named Nini Dior. But Nini was no ordinary woman. She was older than Rascher, eccentric, and fiercely devoted to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Some said she had been Himmler's lover. Others whispered she could influence his decisions with a single letter. Whatever the truth, one fact is certain: Nini opened the gates of hell for Rascher. Through her, he gained direct access to Himmler, and with it, the power to conduct experiments no civilian doctor would ever be allowed to attempt. Rascher's early correspondence with Himmler reads like a scientist's diary written in code. He wrote of biological endurance, the expansion of human potential, and the boundaries of physiology. But between the lines, the words reeked of obsession. To Rascher, pain was not something to avoid. It was a tool, a means to unlock secrets no textbook could teach. By 1941, Rascher was already testing the limits of the human body in ways few could imagine. After his success with hypothermia experiments, he proposed something new: high-altitude testing. Germany's Luftwaffe was losing pilots to sudden decompression during flights at extreme altitudes. Planes would rise too fast, oxygen levels would drop, and within seconds, the crew would lose consciousness. Rascher promised a solution. He could simulate those conditions on the ground. Inside Dachau, a steel pressure chamber was installed, disguised as a medical unit. But what happened inside that chamber was anything but medicine. Pressurized air, faint heartbeat. Prisoners were locked inside. The air slowly drained. At 10,000 meters, they gasped for breath. At 15,000, their eardrums burst. At 20,000, their lungs ruptured, their veins filled with bubbles, and their bodies convulsed violently. Rascher and his assistants watched. They took notes. Sometimes they filmed. The footage, silent, black and white, captured men thrashing, their limbs trembling, their faces turning pale and still. Rascher would later show these films to Himmler himself. Himmler called them fascinating. To him it was progress. To Rascher, it was validation, the applause of power. As the months passed, Rascher's experiments grew increasingly erratic. He combined hypothermia trials with pressure chamber tests, pushing the boundaries of endurance far beyond anything useful to science. It was no longer research, it was spectacle, a cruel theater of life and death. Yet inside the Reich, Rascher's name began to rise. He was now considered an innovator. His results were distributed among SS physicians. Some even suggested he be appointed as a professor of medicine after the war. But ambition, like ice, can crack under its own weight. Rascher's thirst for recognition soon eclipsed his control. He began falsifying reports, manipulating data to make his results appear more impressive. He claimed breakthroughs that never existed, and worse, he began lying about his personal life. Nini, desperate to maintain their privileged status, convinced Rascher to stage a series of bizarre deceptions. She claimed to have miraculously given birth to children in her 50s, proof, she said, of a secret fertility treatment Rascher had developed. They presented the infants to Himmler as living evidence of reproductive rejuvenation. For a time the ruse worked. Himmler was amazed. He even wrote to Rascher personally, praising his contribution to the future of German motherhood. But the truth has a way of thawing through lies. SS investigators discovered that the children were not Nini's at all. They had been stolen from other families. When Himmler learned of the fraud, the reaction was immediate. Rascher's letters went unanswered. His funding was frozen, his access revoked. He had betrayed the Reich, not by murder, not by torture, but by deceit. And in the Third Reich, deceit against the SS was a sin greater than cruelty. In early 1944, Rascher was arrested by the Gestapo. He was brought back to Dachau, the very place where his victims had screamed, frozen, and died under his watch. Now he was the prisoner. Those who saw him in his final days described a man hollowed by fear. The same man who once spoke of scientific courage now trembled in silence. No instruments, no assistants, no notebooks, only the cold stone walls of the camp he had turned into a laboratory of pain. On April 26, 1945, days before the liberation of Dachau, Rascher was executed by the SS, a single bullet to the back of the head. No trial, no mercy. The irony was brutal. His victims had frozen for hours. He died in seconds. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, lost among the thousands who perished there. His name was erased from SS records. Officially, it was as if he had never existed, but the legacy of his crimes could not be buried. After the war, Allied investigators uncovered his reports, films, and personal letters. The images, still frames of twisted bodies, contorted faces, frozen limbs, were used as evidence during the Nuremberg trials. When the footage was shown in court, witnesses wept. One American prosecutor described it as the most inhuman thing ever captured on film. The world learned that Rascher's work had not been the effort of a lone madman, but the reflection of an entire system that rewarded cruelty, that sanctified obedience, that blurred the line between science and sadism. In the end, the story of Dr. Sigmund Rascher is not just about a man, it is about what happens when intellect serves ideology, when medicine becomes a weapon, when the pursuit of progress silences compassion. He was called doctor, he wore a uniform, he spoke the language of research. But behind every calculation, every experiment, every word written in his neat clinical handwriting, there was only the sound of suffering. Rascher's story is a reminder that evil does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers in Latin, hides behind a microscope, and signs its name in blue ink. His victims, nameless, forgotten, frozen, never saw justice, but their silence remains the loudest testimony. Because every heartbeat that stopped in that ice-cold chamber became a warning to the world. Science without conscience is death in disguise, and so ended the life of Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a man who tried to conquer the cold but was consumed by it. When the gates of Dachau were opened in April 1945, the war was nearly over, but for those who entered, it was as if they had stepped into a realm outside of time, a place where the limits of human cruelty had been methodically studied, measured, and recorded. The Allied forces who walked through the camp's corridors did not encounter soldiers or weapons of war. They encountered silence, the kind that only follows prolonged suffering. Piles of bodies, the faint smell of chemical disinfectants, and rows of bunk beds where men had once waited to die. This was not the front line, this was the laboratory of death. Among the rubble and ashes, investigators found documents, film reels, handwritten notes, and stacks of clinical charts. The papers bore names that would soon become synonymous with horror: Sigmund Rascher, Holzlöhne, Finke. Each notebook detailed temperatures, times, and causes of death. In the margins, notes were scribbled in cold precision: subject unresponsive after 53 minutes, heart failure observed, body temperature at 26 degrees Celsius. The handwriting was calm, detached, scientific. These records were not the work of monsters in mythic tales, but of doctors, men once sworn to preserve life. Their victims had not been soldiers, but prisoners, Jews, Poles, Russians, political dissidents. The data they left behind, meticulously recorded, stamped with official seals, would soon become evidence in the most infamous medical trial in history. In 1946, inside a court in Nuremberg, the world heard what had been hidden behind barbed wire and secrecy. 23 men stood accused, physicians, researchers, officers of the Reich. They were not tried as soldiers, but as scientists who had betrayed the very foundation of medicine. The courtroom was silent as prosecutors displayed photographs of the experiments: emaciated bodies submerged in ice baths, corpses twisted by altitude tests, victims bound in freezing water until their hearts stopped beating. Witnesses described the sounds, the screams echoing through the barracks, the pleas for warmth, the faint rasp of breath as the body fought against hypothermia. Others spoke of Rascher's camera, how it continued rolling even after the subject's heart had stopped, capturing the final frozen expression. The footage was shown in court, and for many who watched, it was the first time they saw what science had become under the shadow of the swastika. The prosecution's case was simple, yet devastating. Medicine had been turned into an instrument of torture, and the white coat had become a uniform of death. When the judges heard the testimonies, even hardened soldiers looked away. The defense argued that the research was meant to advance aviation safety, to protect pilots from freezing at high altitude, but the justifications collapsed under the weight of the evidence. The so-called scientific progress had been built on human agony. Rascher himself was already dead, executed by his own comrades in 1944, his body buried in the same soil that had swallowed his victims. Yet his presence haunted the courtroom. His notebooks were displayed like sacred relics of madness. His handwriting was compared against autopsy reports, confirming his direct hand in dozens of deaths. The name Rascher became a symbol, not of discovery, but of the collapse of morality and science. When the verdicts were read, some of the doctors were sentenced to death by hanging. Others, astonishingly, were acquitted, declared free men, as if their intellect or wartime context excused the cruelty. The gallows awaited only a few, but the moral weight of their crimes would linger for generations. The court declared that medical research must never again place human life secondary to scientific ambition. And yet, even as the judges condemned the atrocities, another, quieter debate was already taking shape, not in courtrooms, but in military laboratories and government offices. Allied scientists, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, began studying the confiscated data. The reports contained detailed findings on human responses to hypothermia, high-altitude pressure, and rewarming techniques, information that had cost hundreds of lives to obtain. The dilemma was profound. Could data gathered through inhuman means be used to save future lives? Some argued that ignoring it would waste the suffering of the victims. Others insisted that any use of the results would immortalize the crimes. Behind closed doors, the arguments blurred the moral boundaries that Nuremberg had tried to draw so clearly. By the early 1950s, American Air Force manuals quietly cited German Cold War research without naming Rascher. Survival instructors used modified versions of his tables to train pilots in emergency procedures. Decades later, references to the experiments resurfaced in scientific literature, sometimes in footnotes, sometimes omitted entirely, but always present like ghosts whispering from the margins of history. Meanwhile, in the Soviet bloc, similar data found its way into aviation medicine. The same equations that had once predicted death in freezing tanks now guided flight simulations and space missions. Progress marched forward, built in part on the ashes of Dachau. For historians and ethicists, the question never disappeared. Can knowledge born of torture ever be pure? Is there a moral line that, once crossed, contaminates everything it touches? Every attempt to use Rascher's research reopened the wound. The numbers he recorded, pulse rates, body temperatures, times of death, were not abstract data points. They were the remnants of human beings whose names had been erased. In the decades that followed, survivors of the camps testified again and again, ensuring the world would not forget. They spoke of men stripped naked, shivering in the cold, waiting for the inevitable. They spoke of the false promises that cooperation might mean mercy, and of the realization that mercy had no place in those walls. Their stories became living counterpoints to the sterile numbers in the notebooks. As new generations of doctors swore the Hippocratic Oath, the lessons of Nuremberg were invoked like sacred commandments. Never again should science serve ideology. Never again should data justify cruelty. And yet, in research labs and ethical debates, the echoes of Rascher's work still provoke unease. Each time a scientist faces a moral compromise, the ghost of Dachau lingers, a reminder of how far reason can fall when ambition eclipses humanity. Today, the ruins of the camp remain preserved as a memorial. Visitors walk through the same barracks where experiments once took place. The cold wind cuts through the open gates, carrying with it the faint smell of burnt wood and rusted iron. In the exhibition halls behind glass are the surviving pages of Rascher's reports, yellowed, fragile, written in meticulous German script. They are not displayed as scientific achievements, but as warnings carved into paper. The trial that followed the war was not just about punishing men, it was about defining the limits of civilization itself. The judges at Nuremberg declared that there exists a law higher than the orders of any government, the law of humanity. And from that principle, a new code was born, the Nuremberg Code, the foundation of modern medical ethics, asserting that no experiment may be conducted without voluntary consent. But even as the world vowed never again, history reminds us that memory is fragile. Time blurs outrage into curiosity. What once seemed unthinkable becomes a topic of study, then a footnote, then a forgotten lesson. The moral abyss of Rascher's science stands as a mirror, reflecting both the darkness and the potential of human intellect. In the end, the question remains unanswered. Is it possible to separate the discovery from the suffering? Can knowledge born in cruelty ever serve good, or is it forever cursed? A monument to the moment when science lost its soul. The silence that followed Nuremberg was not peace. It was the quiet of a world forced to look at itself and realize that progress, without conscience, is just another form of destruction. Today, Dachau stands still. The iron gates remain open, the barbed wire rusted by time and rain. The words Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, still hang above the entrance, no longer as propaganda, but as a cruel reminder of the lies that once governed this place. The camp is no longer filled with orders, shouted in German, or the mechanical rhythm of boots striking gravel. Now the only sound is the wind, whispering through the barracks, brushing against the memorial stones, carrying the faint echo of something that refuses to die. The laboratories are empty. The tables where bodies were once measured and dissected are gone, replaced by plaques describing what happened here. Yet the air is dense, almost as if it remembers. Visitors speak in hushed tones, not out of reverence alone, but because any sound feels intrusive, as though words themselves might disturb the ghosts that linger in the cold. In one of the old blocks, behind glass, lies a small notebook. Its pages are brittle, the ink fading into sepia. It belonged to Dr. Sigmund Rascher. On it, neat handwriting describes the temperature of the human body at the moment of death, the time it takes for the heartbeat to stop, the intervals between shivering and silence. There are no names, no compassion, no acknowledgement of the suffering behind the data, only numbers, the precision of cruelty. Thousands of people pass through Dachau each year, some come as historians, others as students, others simply because they cannot comprehend how such a place could have existed. They walk through the same corridors where prisoners once shuffled barefoot on freezing concrete. They see the remnants of the showers, the bunk beds stacked like cages, the crematorium that stands as a monument to systematic death. The walls do not speak, but the silence says everything. One survivor, interviewed decades after the liberation, described it simply: "The cold never left me, it lives in my bones." He had survived Raster's experiments, or at least what was left of them, when the war ended. He spoke of the sensation not as a memory, but as a permanent condition. "You think it ends when they take you out of the water," he said, "but the cold stays. It follows you home. It waits for you in your sleep." That man died in his 80s, but even in his final interviews, his hands trembled whenever he spoke about Dachau, not from age, but from memory, and he was not alone. Survivors from the freezing experiments often described the same haunting aftermath. They could no longer tolerate the sound of running water, the clinking of metal, the sterile smell of disinfectant. For them, the world had become one continuous echo of the camp, proof that trauma does not end with survival. It endures, generation after generation, as if the cold itself were passed through the blood. Historians and scientists still argue about what to do with Raster's data. Some insist it must be erased from every medical reference, that to preserve it is to give legitimacy to his crimes. Others argue the opposite, that it should remain, not as science, but as evidence, a warning, a mirror, something that forces every generation to confront what happens when intellect is severed from morality. This debate is not about numbers or procedures. It is about memory, about whether forgetting is mercy or betrayal. In 1989, when researchers revisited the Dachau reports, they found that some of Rascher's conclusions were scientifically unreliable. His experiments were sloppy, inconsistent, often falsified, but the horror was real, the suffering was real, and so the question remains: what is the moral weight of knowledge born from pain? A modern physician once wrote, "The data from Dachau should not teach us about hypothermia, it should teach us about the limits of the human soul." He argued that the only valuable lesson from those notebooks is not in their numbers, but in the abyss they reveal, that science without empathy becomes indistinguishable from violence. Today, as the world advances into genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and medical frontiers beyond imagination, the echoes of Dachau whisper warnings we still struggle to hear. Every new discovery comes with a shadow. How far will we go in the name of progress? What will we justify in pursuit of knowledge? In universities across the world, medical students learn about the Nuremberg Code, the set of ethical principles born from the trials that exposed Rascher's crimes. Voluntary consent is essential, it declares. The welfare of the subject must always come before the interests of science. It's recited like scripture, but in practice, the temptation remains. The same desire that drove Rascher, the hunger to know, to prove, to achieve, still lives in laboratories today, dressed in modern words and cleaner rooms, because the truth is uncomfortable. The mind that created Dachau's experiments is not unique, it is human, and that is the most terrifying realization of all. Every time a researcher pushes a boundary for the greater good, every time a government hides behind classified science, the moral ice thickens a little more. The line between discovery and desecration becomes thinner. The lessons of Dachau are not frozen in 1945, they are living, breathing tests of conscience. When you walk through the memorial today, you will notice something peculiar. There is no music, no guides speaking loudly, no videos playing in the background, only the sound of footsteps, gravel crunching underfoot, and wind sweeping through the open gates. It feels less like a museum and more like a conversation with absence. You can stand in the center of the camp, close your eyes, and feel it, the weight of history pressing against the present. The cold air wraps around you like a ghost, not malevolent, but mournful. You begin to understand what the survivor meant, that the cold never truly left. It lingers in every generation that tries to forget. There is a section of the memorial called the Path of Remembrance. Along the walkway, stones are engraved with words in multiple languages: never again. The letters are simple, almost fragile. They have been touched by countless hands, by survivors, by soldiers, by children who were not yet born when the war ended. Each touch adds to the collective memory, keeping the warning alive, and that warning is this: when science loses its soul, humanity dies first. Rascher believed he was serving progress. He believed that sacrifice was necessary for knowledge. That belief, that the end justifies the means, has echoed through history again and again. but Dachau stands as proof that the moment morality freezes, civilization begins to decay. The true legacy of Dachau is not in the data preserved in archives, it is in the silence that follows the story, the pause after the final sentence, the breath no one wants to take. It lives in the discomfort of those who visit, in the shiver that runs through them, even on warm days. Because the silence speaks louder than any testimony. It says, this happened, it was real, and it must never happen again. The memorial closes before dusk. As the last visitors leave, the sun sets behind the barbed wire, casting long shadows over the gravel. The temperature drops, and the air grows sharp. For a moment, everything is still, the sky painted in gray and fading gold. Then, as night falls, the wind returns. It moves through the trees, across the empty watchtowers, and into the open courtyards. If you listen closely, the sound resembles breathing, faint, rhythmic, endless. Perhaps it is the earth itself remembering. Fade to black. The sound of wind, cold, endless, empty.